Good afternoon and welcome everyone. Thank you all for joining today's webinar. I'd like to say a special welcome to Henry Kendall Society members. My name is Kiosha Kennedy. As some of you may know, I am the coordinator for the Henry Kendall Society here at UCS. I just wanted to go over one small housekeeping item around technology, because as you know, technology sometimes has a mind of its own. So if you experience any technical issues, have no fear. We have a dedicated staff person, Fozea, who you may contact directly via the chat for assistance at any time. And please submit questions for our speakers through the Q&A function. We encourage you to make comments in chat box during the program. With that, it is my pleasure to welcome our speakers, Paula, Garcia, and Edyta, Sitko, to discuss their work on the report on the road to 100% renewables. Paula Garcia is our senior bilingual energy analyst and energy justice lead in the climate and energy program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. She evaluates energy resource and climate solutions in the electricity sector and works to further public understanding of clean energy technologies, policies, and markets. Edyta Sitko is the energy organizing manager at the Union of Concerned Scientists. In her role, she works with a team of experts and regional allies to advance renewable energy solutions in the Midwest and strategically engages UCS Science Network experts and supporters in campaigns. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to our amazing speakers. And again, thank you all for joining our program.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kiosha. So hello, everyone. I'm Paula Garcia, and I use she, her, ella pronouns. And I've been working with the Union of Concerned Scientists for almost 8 years already. So today we're going to be covering key components from our On the Road to 100% Renewables analysis. And Diana, can you help us with the presentation? I don't know if it's showing already.
Can you see the presentation? And Paula, you are muted.
Diana, can you go to the next slide, please? Perfect. So for our presentation today, first we're going to have an overview of the analysis. Then we will touch on partner engagement. We will be covering the key components of the modeling, some of our results and key recommendations, and then we will close with the products that we produce, their rollout, and then we will have a Q&A session. Next slide, please. All right, perfect. So I will start with a question for, no, please, that one, yeah. So I have a question for those who are attending the conversation today, and it is, as you see in the map, those are the states that we focus on. It would be great to learn from which state are you calling in today. If you want to write in the chat, that would be awesome, so we get an idea of where people are located. I see California, it's part of our analysis. Maryland, great. Wow, Texas is not, unfortunately. Virginia, Massachusetts, definitely. Minnesota, absolutely. All right, so I will continue. Please keep on adding the place where you are located now. Basically, what we wanted to do with our analysis was to analyze how leadership states can address climate change by reducing heat trapping emissions from the electricity sector, understanding how our energy choices most directly affect people's lives, and making sure that we were centering equity in this energy transition throughout. So we focus on 24 states that are members of the United States Climate Alliance. The US Climate Alliance is a bipartisan coalition of governors that are committed to reducing heat trapping emissions consistent with the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. And to achieve so, the electricity sector has a key role to play in decarbonizing the grid, especially as we work in electrifying transportation and buildings. So our analysis analyzes the implications of this group of states meeting 100% of their electricity needs by 2035 through a strengthened renewable electricity standard, or RES. For those that are not very familiar with that term, it's a policy that has been used by many states for a good number of years already. And basically, a renewable electricity standard is a mandate requiring retail electricity suppliers to provide a certain percentage of their electricity from renewable energy sources. So this level of ambition that we include in our analysis, which is 100% by 2035, is aligned with what is happening in different contexts. The Biden administration has talked about a goal of achieving electricity that is free of carbon pollution by 2035, and also resonates with a growing number of states that are already committing to 100% renewable or carbon-free energy. And there are cities, towns, companies, and different institutions also thinking about moving in that direction. And with that, I will transition to Edyta to share a bit about the partner engagement.
Thanks so much, Paula. Again, my name is Edyta Sitko. I use the she series of pronouns, and I'm the energy organizing manager at UCS. I've been with the organization for about 3 years, and I'm based in Chicago. And just in case she pops up, my cat's name is Dolly. She tends to try to join the presentations. So just picking up where Paula left off, as you can see on the map, the states that we focused on for our analysis, there were actually 3 states that we did sort of micro focus on to evaluate the impacts of moving to 100% policies, specifically on health, energy burden, and economic impacts. And so we partnered with another analytical organization called GreenLink to help us do that analysis, and Paula will go over the results in a little bit as well. But in order to ensure that we have a full understanding of not just the impacts of 100% analysis on these states, but also sort of the on the ground work that's happening there and how an analysis such as ours can contribute to that work. We specifically partnered with 3 organizations that are working on the ground in those main states. So the states we focused on were Minnesota, Massachusetts, and Michigan. We weren't trying to pick 3 states that start with the letter M. That was just a nice coincidence. And then, like I said, we partnered with a group on the ground in each of those states to be our partner and co-author on the analysis. So I want to just introduce those partners really quickly, if we can move to the next slide. So our first partner was, is COPAL. They're an organization, an environmental justice organization based in Minnesota. The 2 partners we worked with from that organization were Marco Hernandez and Leslie Gutierrez. And they have a huge breadth of work that they do in Minnesota, but some of the main issues that they focus on that coincide with our analysis are things like cumulative impacts and air pollution impacts on communities specifically impacted by fossil fuel infrastructure, and then moving to 100% policies within the state of Minnesota. If you can move to the next slide. The next organization that we worked with is it's Green Roots. So they're an organization based in Massachusetts, specifically in Chelsea, outside of Boston or in Boston. And there we worked with them, and this this analysis and the topics are very much in line with the work that the organization is already pursuing, specifically around energy democracy, specifically renewable energy, energy storage, and sort of community ownership of those assets, as well as engagement around equitably modernizing the grid in New England and other issues. And the partner there was John Walkie. And next slide. And then the final group we partnered with was the Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition. So as their name implies, it's a coalition of many different organizations throughout the state of Michigan that have been engaging in a number of issues related to environmental justice, energy democracy, pursuing equitable energy legislative policies, as well as involved on the regulatory level. And we've been working and partnering with this organization for a while, as well as the other two organizations that I named already. So these were our three partners. And then in addition to that, we also partnered with a national organization, the Initiative for Energy Justice, that also provided input into our analysis from the beginning. And just to give you a little bit of insight of how UCS partners with organizations, if we can move to the next slide, I can share some key components there. So at the very beginning, we engaged with conversations with them and around the scope of the analysis and sort of what we're aiming to achieve with the results of the work. And that kind of accumulates into a memorandum of understanding, or MOU, that we sign with the organization, each of the organizations, to ensure that we're sort of on the same page about the work that we're trying to do. And that MOU usually also outlines compensation for our environmental justice partners for their expertise and contribution to the analysis. And then as part of sort of the beginning of the setup of the project, we also had a lot of conversations. So the little slide you're seeing right now is just one of the documents that we all input into, where we had some really robust discussions around specific policy positions and preferences between our organizations, conversations around technologies, conversations around what are the state goals that we're trying to achieve and aim for in 100% RES. And those really were extremely important to sort of set us up for success, so that we're on the same page about not just the scope of the work, but really kind of the direction we're going in, and on the same page about sort of various details that go into the modeling inputs. And then from there, I'm going to pass it back to Paula to discuss some of the modeling details and results.
Thank you, Edyta. Next slide, please. All right, so let's say that in terms of the analytical tools that we use, first, in-house, we use the renewable, the REITs model, the Regional Energy Deployment System. This model was created by NREL, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. And basically what we can get from this model is changes in energy capacity and generation over time, changes in CO2, nitrogen, oxides, and sulfur dioxide emissions, capital investment, and what we also did in terms of how we use this REITs tool is that we got the data at aggregated level for the 24 US climate aligned states, but then we also got specific results for Massachusetts, Michigan, and Minnesota. And then once we had the results from the REITs model, we collaborated with GreenLink Analytics to be able to get to those results that are more connected with our daily life, that can resonate more easily with who we are in our daily life. So we were able to get to results in terms of health impact. So to get to that, we look at reductions in 7 common pollutants. We also were able to get to the monetization of the epidemiological and CO2 emission reductions. We look at the macroeconomic analysis in terms of jobs for Michigan, Massachusetts, and Minnesota, as well as changes in gross domestic product or GDP. And we also look at the changes in energy burden. Next slide, please. And we also look at different scenarios. So we had five different scenarios. The first one is what we call no new policy or business as usual. Basically, current policies and plans that we have in place as of now. We also look at 100% RES. So what if this group of states were to transition to 100% renewable energy standard by 2035? And I have a question for all of you. Do you know what's the sector that pollutes the most in your state? If you could write in the chat, like, let's focus on the electricity sector, the transportation sector, and the building sector. Which of those sectors in your state is the one that is it's creating the largest amount, the highest amount of heat trapping emissions? I see transportation. Transportation is the one that pollutes the most in Massachusetts as well. Buildings is another big problem. So part of the conversation that is happening here in Massachusetts is, oh my gosh, we have a huge problem with transportation and buildings. Let's focus on those sectors and let's leave the energy one on aside for now. And let's focus on these other ones that are like creating this huge problem. So that's why we look at the electrification without decarbonization scenario. Basically, let's reduce emissions from transportation and buildings through electrification, but let's leave the grid as it is right now. And then the other two scenarios that we look at is the restricted fossil fuels, and you will see in a little bit why we look at that specific scenario, because one important piece of this analysis is that we were looking at 100% renewable energy standard by 2035, and that targets consumption, not generation. That's why we look at the restricted fossil fuel scenario. And then we also look at a clean electricity standard, because we know that there are other resources in place right now, like nuclear energy. There are conversations about the role of carbon capture and storage, for instance. So we wanted to see what would be a picture if we were to also include those technologies to comply with 100% kind of policy, more broadly defined. Next slide, please. So in terms of the results, the first big piece of the picture is that for these US climate aligned states, transitioning to 100% renewable electricity standard by 2035 is feasible. So all these US climate aligned states can meet 100% of their electricity consumption with renewables by 2035, even as we are working on electrifying transportation and heating. That for us was like the floor. And the other thing that was very important in terms of the results that you are seeing there is that solar generations in these states grows nearly 9-fold, and wind generation almost 7-fold between 2020 and 2040, I'm sorry. So in 2040, that the other thing that you're going to be seeing here is that electricity generation in the US climate aligned states is 73% renewable. So if you look at the graph on the right, you're seeing a lot of solar, which is the yellow, you see wind, which is the blue, you see other resources, but you're still seeing some fossil fuels. And the reason why this is happening, why it's not 100% renewable, is because there is, as I was saying a little bit earlier, there is a difference between consumption and generation. So all of the US climate aligned states that we analyze will meet all of their own electricity needs with renewable energy as required by the RES. But we still see coal and gas and nuclear that continue operating because the principal US power grid is interconnected across many states, which means that power can be shared across state lines, basically trading of electricity. Next slide, please. So in terms of capacity, what gets built, what we're seeing is that in our 100% RES scenario, solar power in the US Climate Alliance states increases 8 times the 2020 amount that we have, the amount of solar energy that we have in 2020 by 2040. And wind power goes up 5 times. So the combined solar and wind capacity increases an average of 30 gigawatts per year. And this is enough to meet the annual electricity needs of more than 8 million typical households in the United States. And you could say like, oh my gosh, that's a lot. Well, it's a lot, and still it is less than what was built, the capacity of wind and solar that was built nationwide in 2021, I'm sorry. That's one very important piece to keep in mind. The other thing that is very important is the role of energy storage. In our 100% RES scenario, we see a lot of energy storage being built. And this is very important as we are integrating variable electricity supply from solar and wind to be able to fulfill the electricity needs round the clock. And then the other big difference here is that in the comparison between keeping the policies that we have right now and the plans that we have right now in the non-new policy case compared to our 100% RES scenario, in our 100% RES scenario, gas grows slowly compared to non-new policy, and coal capacity drops more quickly. And that's very important in terms of where we need to go to address climate change and to make sure that our communities are able to have a healthy life. Next slide, please. And so a transition to 100% renewable energy is more than just the technology. I love the technology, and what I love the most about the technology is that it's more than it. So a transition to renewable energy yields strong benefits in terms of health, in terms of climate, in terms of our economies, and in terms of energy affordability. So for example, accelerating the deployment of renewable energy as in our 100% RES scenario creates new opportunities, including to install solar arrays and wind facilities. In Michigan alone, our 100% RES policy creates more than 100,000 additional jobs from 2022 through 2040. And in Minnesota, this transition to 100% RES creates almost $5 billion in additional labor income over those years. Next slide, please. The other piece that it's very important is that this transition is needed. It's not just like brings benefit, but we need to see these benefits as soon as possible. So the transition to 100% RES reduces the amount of harmful air pollution from power plants much faster than with the policies that we have in place right now. For example, for sulfur dioxide, emissions from power plants in the US Climate Alliance states fall 88% by 2040 compared to only 27% under current policies and plans. And nitrogen oxides emissions fall 77% compared to only 18% under current policies and plans. And that's just the yellow line is our electrification without decarbonization scenario. The blue line is the non-new policy, and the red line is the results for our 100% RES scenario. You can see the difference is very stark. Next slide, please. So this transition to renewable energy and the benefits in terms of reducing those harmful air pollutants translate in benefits for our health. So this move leads to approximately 6,000 to 30,000 fewer premature deaths, more than 140,000 fewer cases of asthma exacerbation, and 700,000 fewer work days that are being lost due to illness between 2024 and 2040 compared to not taking any action additional to what we have in place right now. The value of public health benefits total, the value of public health benefits is almost 280 billions. 280 billion over these 2 decades of our analysis. Next slide, please. And in terms of the energy burden, the 100% area scenario also reduces the average energy burden, which is the portion of a household income that is spent on energy. For our analysis, the average energy burden across the US Climate Alliance states declines from 3.7, which is what we have at the left side of the graph, 3.7% of income in 2020 to 3% in 2040 in our 100% area scenario. This 3% compared to a 3.3% in 2040 in the no-new policy scenario. So, and the other piece that we are not capturing here, this is important, like you can see that 150 number by the year, the difference between the 2 cases by the year 2040. But what it's important to note here is that we are not capturing here in this calculation other savings that come from moving away from the use of fossil fuel due to electrification. And this includes that people won't need to be paying as much money on gasoline costs for transportation, and we all are seeing how pricey is gasoline right now. And also it helps to avoid the use of oil or propane for home heating. And the next slide. Just as important, cleaning up the power grid can also decrease carbon dioxide emissions. So with the reduction in fossil fuel use in the 100% areas policy, the CO2 emissions from power plants in the US Climate Alliance states are almost 60% below 2020 levels by 2040. The reduction is only over 10% if we were to keep on doing things as we're doing now. Just that's a big comparison. 60% if we take action and transition to 100% area scenario to only 10%. We have a climate crisis, we need to take action. And then in terms of the electrification without decarbonization scenario, the results are also very important to inform the kind of policy advocacy that we need to be doing right now. Pushing for electrification without a strong focus on decarbonizing the grid leads to power plant emissions that are nearly 5 times higher for sulfur dioxide, more than 3 times higher for nitrogen oxides, and more than twice as high for CO2 by 2040 compared to not comparing our electrification without decarbonization to our 100% area scenario. And if we were to compare that electrification without decarbonization to not taking action, CO2 emissions are even higher than current policies and plans. It will be 40% higher. That's something that we all need to keep in mind, internalize, and keep to the front. As we are electrifying transportation and heating is very important. And we need to make sure that the grid is clean to be able to power those other sectors. And with that, I will transition to Edyta.
Thank you so much, Paula. If we can move to the next slide. I want to talk a little bit about another portion of our analysis or report, which is the policy recommendations. So if you're familiar with some of our other more recent work, that especially ones that we've done with in partnership with other organizations, such as the Deep Decarbonization Report that came out last summer, or the Let Communities Choose analysis that was released last fall. We do spend a significant amount of time on policy recommendations in this project. And the main reason for that is that, as Paula talked about at the beginning of the results, it's clear that 100% RES policies, while accomplishing many very positive things for communities across the board, they on their own cannot accomplish the equitable energy transition that we need. And that means we need additional policies on top of RES to address pollution exposure and basically ensure that everyone is experiencing the benefits of moving to clean energy. So to give you a quick example of that, as Paula said, even being able to meet 100% RES policy requirements in Michigan, for example, it might not mean that it's going to shut down the coal plant in a corner of Michigan that might be producing power that's selling to Indiana, for example. And so it still creates pollution and a lot of negative impacts for communities in Michigan that we want to address. So in all, we included 17 policy recommendations in the report under the major categories that you see on the slide. I won't go through all the recommendations now, but I did want to note that our local partners really helped to further sharpen and emphasize the policies that stand out to them as being particularly important for their communities. So those are outlined in the state fact sheets and in the main report, and I'll talk about those in a moment as well. So some of these highlights include, again, addressing the problems of new gas plants in pursuit of 100% renewable electricity standards by preventing investments in new fossil fuel infrastructure, both for gas and coal, but gas is sort of the main thing to address there. And then ensuring that we're not just providing access to clean energy programs, but also emphasizing the importance of direct investments in frontline communities to make sure technologies and savings reach all communities across the board. And then the third component is the need to reduce energy burdens through targeted energy rates with respect to procedural justice. So ensuring that communities have actual power in decision-making, not just the ability to participate or provide input into policies. So that's a little bit about the recommendations. And last but not least, just wanted to talk a little bit about sort of the products and the outreach components. So if we can move to the next slide. Thank you. So as you can see on the slide, there are some main products that we released from the analysis. And I actually would love to know, it's always really nice to get feedback on this. As I'm going through these, I would love for y'all, if you could put in the chat, if you've had a chance to review some of these products or seen them on our website yet, which ones you find most exciting or most helpful to work or things that are happening on the ground where you live. So if you can help us out and give us some feedback, so especially for future products, so we know kind of what's most useful for folks, that would be really helpful to know. So the first thing is we call it a mini report because it's a little bit less long than some of our other analysis that we've released, but it's about 20 pages or so. So there's a report that was just produced, as well as an executive summary that's available in Spanish. We also have a state fact sheet for 3 main states, both in English and Spanish. So we have a fact sheet for Michigan, Minnesota, and Massachusetts. And those fact sheets are not necessarily the same across the board, meaning they don't necessarily focus on the same type of information. I just wanted to highlight that. They really do focus, we did try to focus more on issues that relate to specific states based on feedback we received from our partners. And then the third thing I wanted to highlight is the blog post. So there was a wonderful blog that was put out by Paula when we released the report that sort of gives an overview of some of the the results and main themes that we're seeing from the analysis. In addition, our partners are also have and will be putting out blogs. So the one that's highlighted here is by our partner, Bridget Vial from Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition. I highly recommend for you to read that, especially if you're interested in Michigan. It's a great blog. And then there are other things, for example, you guys might be familiar with our Got Science podcast. So there will be specific podcasts released about this report in the very near future. So keep a lookout for that. And just wanted to take a moment to talk about impact of the analysis, because I think it's important for us to look for ways that our analysis and our work can have a real world impact on what's happening on the ground. And that was one of our main sort of focus, one of the main things we wanted to focus on when we did this analysis from the beginning, and in the beginning conversations with our partners, to the efforts that are happening on the ground, especially pursuing 100% policies. So for example, in Minnesota, our partners and UCS staff who are focused on Minnesota work specifically have already been meeting with partners on the ground to give them overview of the analysis, and have plans to how to include the findings of the analysis in some upcoming work specifically around Minnesota's state plan, climate action plan. And then also are going to be meeting with some legislators to give them briefings on the analysis and what it can mean for policies and in Minnesota. In Michigan, we've already used the report to actually submit comments into the Michigan Healthy Climate Plan. That was a process that was put forth by Governor Whitmer. And then in Massachusetts, I know that the folks on the ground are planning meetings with legislators to also brief them on the findings of the report to contribute to work there that's happening on the ground. So just a little bit about how we've used the report. We've also I think this is our fourth or fifth presentation on the analysis. So we've been asked to present in a number of networks, coalition partners, and others on the analysis. We have another presentation coming up later this week for the Clean Energy States Alliance. We're really glad to see that the analysis, that folks are finding the analysis interesting and useful to their work, and we hope that will continue. And last, but definitely not least, just wanted to mention, for us, it was also really important that this was useful to our partners that we on the ground that we worked with on this analysis. And we've received really great feedback from them. If you go to the next slide, that engaging in this analysis and the process around it was helpful and useful for them and in their efforts moving forward. So very excited about that. Passing it back to you, Paula.
Yes, perfect. Next slide, please. All right, so in closing, I just want to elevate that this work is only possible thanks to the contribution of a large group of highly committed colleagues at UCS and at our partner organizations. And what you're seeing here is the core team. The list is even longer, and I just want to bring visibility to that. And next slide. And with that, we close our presentation. Thank you so much. What you see here is one of our partners from COPAL. You can read the sentence. Thank you so much. And with that, let's transition to a Q&A.
Paula, Edyta, we do have a question in the Q&A chat box. So if you can direct your eyes there and you can ask that question.
Perfect. Would you like to read out maybe for anyone that has not access to the Q&A box?
I'll read it, yes. In Maryland, we have electrical choice so people can choose clean energy suppliers. Unfortunately, Maryland allows vendors to use unbundled REC. This allows providers to provide dirty energy, but claim it is clean via the RECs. So basically, they charge more for the same dirty energy provided by the state's local provider. Have you done research on the unbundled RECs? Have a policy statement on them?
Yeah, thank you so much, Dave, for that question. And I will say that that was one of those things that we really wanted to get in this analysis, but we just needed like to be clear about what was going to be the scope. And this was like a scope creep. It was a topic in itself to include in the analysis, the issue around RECs and RECs trading. But that's definitely something that the team has been talking about as a potential for follow-up in terms of what analysis could come next after this on the road to 100% renewables first approach.
All right, we have a couple of more questions in the chat, but I'd like to encourage everyone, if you have a question, please type it in the Q&A box. The next question here is, has UCS also done a backward-looking analysis of health, microeconomics, and equity impacts?
Could you, Lisa, could you please expand on that question, please?
Yes, so this is forward-looking, and I guess the question is, if we look at states who have had an RES for a while, and compare them maybe to neighbors or equivalent states who have not. Can we do that kind of comparison of these factors, or is there some way to see, to kind of see what the difference actually has been in the past as a way of validating the model?
Wow, that's a great take, Lisa. We have not done that. I know that in terms of macroeconomics, there are other organizations that have done similar analysis. But yeah, no, we have not done it. I can tell you that in-house we don't have that tool. That's why we collaborated with GreenLink Analytics to be able to get to the health impacts and the macroeconomic impacts. I could ask GreenLink if I could ask follow up with GreenLink and ask them if they have done something similar in the past. And if you want to share your email, I can follow up with you after the webinar.
Okay, thank you.
And to your question, I think that there was another question from you in terms of yes, the one about other states like Wisconsin. Is that from you as well?
Well, Wisconsin is right next to Michigan, so I'm wondering, I did not see on your map whether Wisconsin was included in the states with an RES.
Yeah, so what we did is that we focus on the US Climate Alliance states, and I believe that Wisconsin is not one of those states. But right now, actually, we are starting our planning season for what we're going to be working next fiscal year. And we already received a request from a partner in Wisconsin who is very interested in being able to replicate the analysis that we did for the state of Wisconsin. Just expanding a little bit on that, we focus on the US Climate Alliance states because of the commitment from the governor to advance the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement, and the electricity sector has a key role to play. And we also dive into Massachusetts, Michigan, and Minnesota because we are currently working in those states. But definitely something that we will be discussing and exploring in terms of what could be the next steps from this analysis.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Gracias.
Lisa. Another question we have here is, do you recommend some short-term expansion in natural gas power in order to accelerate decrease of coal power or not?
Wow, what a question. What I can tell you is that investing at this point in new fossil fuel infrastructure, it's a risky proposition. We know that we need to decrease emissions rapidly to be able to decrease heat trapping emissions at the pace that the IPCC is requesting from us. It's already hard to get to a 1.5%. I do not believe that investing in new fossil fuel infrastructure will help us to get there. It has significant equity implication as well in terms of what's going to happen in terms of air pollution, where that infrastructure is going to be built, emissions to build the infrastructure, to run the infrastructure, and then potentially stranded assets as we decide that, okay, we're ready to move to other clean technologies, then what's going to happen with those investments, recent investments that are being done in that infrastructure that was supposed to be used for 20 years or more. So it's a very risky proposition. Edyta, I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I just wanted to emphasize the last point that you just made. So again, when we're looking at investments into things like new natural gas plants, those are usually need to be long-term investments to make them basically profitable for consumers or for the ratepayers, right? Because it's usually the ratepayers that are picking up the bill for those things through, various regulatory processes in the state for states that are regulated. And so we're finding ourselves in the situation, for example, in Michigan, some unprudent investments that were made by a utility in coal plants that are closing because they're uneconomic now early. And basically, ratepayers are left on the hook to pay off the rest of the debt for those coal plants. So really financially, it's just a really risky thing to put on ratepayers, although usually it ends up being financially okay for the utilities themselves.
Great. So another question we have here. If a state is part of the U.S. Climate Alliance, as I believe Colorado is, what are the benefits or tools available to local rural electric co-ops in the state?
Could the person that wrote that question expand a little bit in terms of the benefits or tools?
Yes, we have a local rural electric co-op that is rather backwards in the sense that they want to charge people who use less electricity more than people who use more electricity because they're not making any money, even though it's a co-op. They still have to break even at some point. But Colorado, I believe, is part of this U.S. Climate Alliance of states. And if so, what are the benefits for the state for that, and particularly for this co-op that they could take advantage of that would help them to develop a better economic plan, for example?
Thank you for that question. I do think that it has to do a lot with how the RES is being defined and what exceptions are being allowed. There are many places where munis are not required to fulfill the requirement. So some of the work that I have been seeing happening at state level is to be able to change that kind of regulation through legislation so that munis are also required to fulfill the requirement. So I will need to read more about Colorado because I am not familiar with the mandates that are in place right now, but my recommendation would be if they're being exempt from the requirement to push for legislation to address that issue.
Thank you. Another question we have here is Washington is investing in a hydrogen hub. How much of a role do you expect hydrogen hub to play in future clean energy, especially for transportation and industrial purposes?
The next hot topic, hydrogen. Well, hydrogen, there are different categories for hydrogen, and it has to do with how it's being produced. There is gray hydrogen, there is green hydrogen that it's supposedly created using renewable resources. Gray hydrogen can include other fossil fuel controversial kind of approaches. So my first reaction to your question is, what's the source that is being used to create that hydrogen? Okay, you're referring to green hydrogen. There is a lot of energy going on into that conversation, and it has to do a lot with it. This analysis is focusing on 24 US climate aligned states. The results would be different if we were to be looking at the entire country. And there is this tension about, so what are we going to be doing for that 5 or 10% of our generation at a country level? And green hydrogen could really be an important resource to fill that gap.
All right, thank you. Our next question here, and before I read it, I'd like to encourage the audience, if you have any questions at all, please take the opportunity to submit it in the Q&A chat box. Our next question here is, what infrastructure, i.e. grid enhancement, is needed for 100% RES?
There is going to be an important need for transmission and grid modernization. Transmission was not the focus of this analysis. We identified that there are some requirements from the Regional Energy Deployment System, or REDS. We get results in terms of the new transmission infrastructure that is going to be needed. In the report, we included like a small section on the costs that are going to be needed to be put in place to address that built-in transmission. And then there is another thing that I also want to add. There are, as with every tool that we use, there are like benefits and there are limitations. One of the limitations of the tools that we use is that it's very hard to address, to get to what's the role of distributed generation. We are talking about a large amount of renewable energy that is going to be needed to be built over the next 15 to 20 years. And yes, large deployment, like large projects are very important. Let's say in the East Coast, all the energy that we are seeing going to offshore wind, very important. How are we going to make sure that we can send that electricity to where it's going to be used? It's a major point of conversation, and how to make sure, do we need a regional transmission system, and how to make that happen? That's there. And also, we should be taking advantage of the built environment, taking the roofs of the houses that are suited to install rooftop solar, pair it with energy storage. And there are different institutions, research institutions, that have assessed the potential of the built environment to help in that transition. Our tool, unfortunately, was not the best one to get to those kind of results of what's the role of distributed generation, but I just want to elevate that as one of the pieces of the equation to transition to 100% renewable energy grid.
Yeah, I think what you just said, Paula, is extremely important, and it's one of the sort of hot topic discussions where we're talking about transmission and grid. And just adding to it, because Paula and I are actually part of this week of planning retreats that we're doing for our campaign, right? And discussing kind of what we're going to be working on in FY23. One of the main points of discussion is exactly this. And a lot of the work that we've done in state level, for example, to advance RESs, now we're sort of reaching a challenge where, you know, reliability to be able to meet those commitments and those kinds of things are really at the forefront of the discussions, because there are some real challenges there. And let's say, you know, fossil fuel interests are also using that as an excuse to roll back or try to stunt policies that have already been passed, sort of, you know, saying the grid is not ready, this is why we need to continue using gas and other things before we switch to renewable energy. So it's a real problem on the ground, and it's something that we are in a lot of active conversations and work that UCS has been doing for years, as on the local as well as the sort of federal and regional level with the regional transmission organizations. And one of the things that we're really looking forward to at the end of this year and next year is to host some grid convenings, as we're calling them. So we're building those now, and basically having a space to have conversations with advocates, folks on the ground, specifically about addressing some of these major issues around the grid, both from this is what we desperately need to reach our renewable energy goals, and ensuring that we're that advocates and people who are directly impacted by those decisions, including big transmission decisions, have a voice and are also able to discuss alternatives to that, like distributed generation.
Thank you, Paula and Edyta, for bringing your expertise to this webinar. I want to take a moment to express my sincere gratitude for all of you who are on this call, for your continued support. Your commitment to our work is essential to advance the policies needed for an equitable transition to renewable energy, and we are deeply appreciative of your partnership in this work. Thank you all, and I hope you all please enjoy the rest of your day.